Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ModGear. This week, I'm driving the Koenigsegg CCX, a car born from Sweden, and is quite literally a monster. So, let's just get right into it, shall we? But, before we begin this week's episode, let's take a step back in the past for a brief history lesson. Our story of the CCX begins in 1996. Our boys in Sweden, in this case being Koenigsegg, were making their first car, and that being the Koenigsegg CC. The CC, well, it was basically a prototype car, and it was what was going to be used to help create what would then develop to be the CC8S, which would basically be Koenigsegg's first production car, I think. Don't quote me on that because I'll probably get it wrong. The CC8S premiered in 2002 and was first actually unveiled properly at the 2000 Paris Auto Show, because again, Paris. But the car itself didn't actually go onto the market until 2002. The car was actually pretty loved by most critics around the world, and people actually liked it. Although it did have a Ford modular V8, so, we will have to question if it was a Ford, but, we'll gloss over that. Sadly, only 6 examples of the CC8S were basically made for the entire world. And, well, because they were made that short, because back then, Koenigsegg was not a big manufacturer, much like manufacturers like Ford or Ferrari, for example. So they couldn't really make a lot of cars. And so only 6 examples of the CC8S were made and sent out to the entire world. So they're extremely rare. After the CC8S went out of production in 2004, Koenigsegg then brought out the CCR to take its place. The CCR and the CCX, since they're basically the same car, let's be honest here, I'm going to reference basically all the things I say about the CCR are basically the same in the CCX. The CCR was powered by a pretty massive 4.7-liter twin supercharged V8, and the car made around 806 horsepower. It was also rear-wheel drive, so therefore, there was going to be a lot of wheel spin involved, let's just be honest here. Also, it was quite surprising that this particular engine was something that Koenigsegg made themselves. Koenigsegg made their engine in-house because they didn't take something from Ford directly, so it was very impressive to see that they actually made their own engine. The CCR was also the first car to have a little ghost on it. The reason why this is, there is because apparently Koenigsegg was building at a factory or a facility that once belonged to a Swedish fighter jet squadron, which had part of the Swedish military at some point. Dudes approached them, they're like, hey, can you incorporate ghosts on our cars to, honor us or something? And Koenigsegg's like, okay. And so that's why the ghosts have been there. And also, the CCR, for about a solid 2 months, in 2005, actually had broke the production speed record for achieving the highest top speed that a production car had made, being able to reach 241.01 miles per hour, which, let's be honest here, 241 miles an hour is pretty quick. Unfortunately, just a few months later, the first prototypes of the Bugatti Veyron would first come out and set that speed record by achieving somewhere around 253 miles an hour. So yeah, this record got topped it got topped pretty quickly, but trust me, at least Koenigsegg had some kind of fame, and even now they still hold the current speed record. Well, now they don't, because, you know, it's complicated. They've always been under rivalry. And then, beginning in 2006, after the CCR had ended production, the CCX was born to replace the CCR. And well, as I said earlier, the CCX and the CCR are basically the same car. They have the same engines, they kind of have the same parts, so there really isn't much to explain here. But altogether, the CCX is an awesome car, and while there wasn't that many made, same here with the CC8S, there wasn't like, 6 made, there was a pretty good amount made. But again, this was at a time when Koenigsegg was still a very small manufacturer, and up to now where they can make a lot more cars than they could then, the CCX is still an awesome car to drive, if that's actually you manage to get one. And being all-wheel drive, having an old-school manual transmission as well, you're gonna have some very tough issues trying to shift, especially when you have that much wheel spin, but let's be honest here, it's still a good car either way. And nowadays, the CCX soul now lives on in the Agera, which sadly went out of production some time later, and is now being replaced by the new Jesko. I believe it's what it's called, Jesko. Koenigsegg, you're weird with your Swedish names. But anyway, with that pretty solidly monstrous history lesson out of the way, we can get to this week's episode. Take it away, Panda. Thank you, Mr. History Panda, and with that, we can begin today's tests, starting with the top speed test. Welcome to the Genesis 1 Mile Dragway. It's a place where many cars come to push their engines and, well, a surprisingly large amount of their speed, to their limit, simply to put their speed onto the boards. So let's see how well the Koenigsegg CCX can do in this test. The CCX, Koenigsegg, Monster, whichever you want to call it, topped out at a mind-blowingly fast 169.3 miles per hour. It's definitely safe to say that my back has, well, basically been punctured by this. It's definitely an amazing run either way from the CCX. Next up is the massive exhaust of the brake test. The goal of this test is very simple. We want to make sure that all 4 of the car's brakes stop once it passes this white line. The goal of the test is to not hit the parked Nissan Leaf, and if you do, you want to measure your distance based on how far the Nissan Leaf moves from its parking spot. So let's see how well the Koenigsegg can do in this test. The CCX does have some pretty good brakes, that's, if you're actually braking. But its insane acceleration as it came closer to the Leaf is definitely what made it struggle here. It's an unfortunate run from the CCX, but I definitely do feel like if it had more breathing room to stop, then this would be possible. Next up is the cornering test, and to do that, I've come here. This is the Forksville test circuit. Developed by the ModGear development team, it's used to help judge a car's endurance on tight corners, tight bends, and jumps, to further prove how a car might perform on a track-focused setting. So let's see how well the CCX can do on the circuit. The CCX doesn't do good in this test at all. The brakes do take some time to slow down the car, as mentioned before. The car just stops whenever the front end hits a curb, because that makes sense. And it can't even pass the jump section of this track because, well, the car just gets stuck on the ramp. It's also really, really slippery, and it's very hard to control with that 800 horsepower and rear-wheel drive. It is a very, very unfortunate run from the CCX. Next up is the rear view camera of the parallel park test. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to make sure that we can park the CCX between these two parked Renault Megans, but we also want to make sure that there's enough distance both in the front and in the back of the car for someone to walk through. So let's see how well the CCX can do in this test. And with a bit of work, I will say, the CCX passes this test. Next up is the broken suspension of the gravel road segment. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to see how well a car's suspension and overall ride can endure on day-to-day driving conditions. Whether this be bumps, potholes, cracks, and roads, whatever it may be, we want to see how suspension travel works, body roll, that kind of thing. So let's see how well the CCX can do in this test. The CCX doesn't really do well in this test either. The suspension, much like other cars shown in the season, is, well, it's basically dying. The undercarriage, as well as the front and rear ends of the car, aren't having fun either, as there are sparks coming out, they're hitting the ground, stuff like this. So it's an unfortunate run from the Koenigsegg. Next up is the up and down hills of the bump test. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to see how well cars can tackle just regular bumps. See how their front end and back ends handle these bumps, if they're going to get destroyed, and overall just see how well suspension travel works on bumps. So let's see how well the CCX can do in the bump test. Similar to the previous test and other tests, and whatnot, the CCX doesn't do good here either. The undercarriage of the car is, well, it's simply being destroyed, and the car was actually in the air a few times going over these bumps, so unless you want to destroy the car, then you probably shouldn't do this. It's a very sad and unfortunate run from the CCX. Next up is the twist and turns of the slalom test. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to see how body roll and a loss of cornering can affect a car while on a track focus setting. We already know a little bit as to how the CCX corners and body roll and loss of speed, but we're going to test this anyway as they get a better idea of what this car can do on a track-like setting. So let's see how well the CCX can do. The CCX does okay in the slalom test. My only major complaint is really how the car comes out of these corners. As mentioned in the cornering test from before, this car is very slippery, and you're definitely going to be able to tell that it is when the car comes out of a corner because, well, it's going to try to slide and spin out because, again, 800 horsepower rear-wheel drive, it's going to happen. It's an okay run from the CCX, but the sliding part of it is just a little too much. The MPJ figures the CCX has are actually kind of surprising, as Koenigsegg actually made this somewhat economical. The car has an average of around 17 miles per gallon in the city and 22 miles per gallon in the highway. But I'm still gonna highly doubt this because, well, there's a number of reasons as to why, but you could probably already tell. But anyway, regardless of this, how do these figures apply on the track?
Oh god! What the fuck? What the fuck, okay?
Oh shit! Oh shit!
And now, let's give the Koenigsegg CCX an official lap around the Futaro circuit. The official standard time is 1:24:67. With added up accidents and collisions, the final adjusted time is 1:29:67.
The CCX is under all these boxes. I'm gonna leave the rest to you. Just don't go crazy. Will you?
Well, shit.
Let's do this!
Oh, these are pretty cool bananas.
Ah! Jesus Christ! Oh, fuck! Oh, it's hot and bright on fire! God fucking damn it! Oh, what the fuck?
All good to go.
Oh no!
Nice car. But it doesn't belong on the track. Time to lay dust to this fool.
Fuck him up! God fucking damn it!
Holy Jesus.
You got talent, kid. I'd love to race you again someday.
Okie dokie. Thank you.
What do you think that kid does for a living? To afford a CCX?
Probably selling masks for COVID-19.
Good one, Matthew.
So, what are my final thoughts on the Koenigsegg CCX? Well, it's definitely a bit mixed. This car has some insane top speed, being able to hit near 170 miles per hour, but is slippery in both its handling and its cornering, because again, rear-wheel drive, 800 horsepower, it's not going to work. Its brakes are somewhat pretty solid, it just depends on what you're doing, and the suspension just basically sucks altogether. If you're doing this as a weekend car, then by all means, this is a good weekend car. It's just going to suck a little bit, but it's definitely not a car used for daily driving. So don't expect, to go to the shops, get your groceries or stuff like that in this car, because it ain't going to happen. But regardless of this, it's still an insane car, and I highly recommend that you still give this car a shot if and when you actually find one in the wild, because let's face it, there's not a lot of these cars left, and, they're very rare anyway, so if you do find one, definitely take the chance to at least drive it, because it's awesome. But anyway, on that insane-like note, it's time to end. Thank you so much for watching, we'll see you next week. Good night.